This video is sponsored by the Rich Wallet. I will show you the easiest way to make incredible sourdough bread. If you're a beginner, this is the place to start. Hi, I'm Sune and I'm a food geek. Today I will talk about and show you my updated master recipe. This is my third iteration of this recipe, where the first one was in the School of Tartine. I made a much simplified version in 2020. And now I thought it was time to incorporate all of the accumulated knowledge. If you're interested in my experiments, there's a link to my playlist with all of them in the description. The information in this video will help you get started if you're just getting into sourdough baking. Or it will give you a much simpler way to make sourdough bread just as good as the much more complicated methods. First, you will need a sourdough starter. You can make one yourself, buy a dried one online, or you might be able to get one from your local bakery. I have your video in the card above if you want to make it yourself. Come back when you have an active starter. So let's talk a little bit about tools. The bare essentials you'll need that you might not have in your kitchen are 1. A bench scraper. Do you need a fancy one like I have? No. When I first started, I'd use a paint scraper. Just make sure it's made with stainless steel. 2. A lamb. A lamb is just a fancy holder for an old school razor blade. Can you hold it with your fingers? Yes. Should you? No. Ask me how. Do you need a fancy one made from walnut with golden trimmings? No, but you'll look damn good scoring your bread if you do. 3. A Dutch oven or a pot that can go in the oven at high temperatures. You need some way to create steam to bake your sourdough bread, and the easiest way is to put the bread into a Dutch oven and let it steam itself with the water inside. 4. A scale that measures grams. Most of my viewers are from the States, so you will likely be as well. Why do you need this? Well, you can, without a doubt, make bread using measuring cups, but there's a vast difference how much flour can be in a measuring cup if it's packed or loose. By weight, it's always the same. So why not use a scale that measures ounces? Well, if you live in the States, you should get a model that measures both. But 1 ounce is the equivalent of approximately 28.3 grams. So it's hard to get precise with ounces. So it will matter if you want your loaves to turn out the same each time. Also, when you look up sourdough recipes online, they're mostly in grams, even by American bakers. That's the essentials. You are, of course, also going to be needing bowls, scrapers, wire racks, and all of those things that are in a typical kitchen. Most of the items you see in this and my other videos about sourdough are linked in the description. Note that those are affiliate links, so if you buy through my link, I will get a kickback. I thought it was important that you know that. Have you ever given a bad Father's Day gift? The Rich Wallet expands to hold up to 12 cards plus room for cash, while remaining as slim as possible. They come in over 30 colors and styles, including carbon fiber, burnt titanium, forged ember, and this gorgeous base camp orange. Now the Rich also solved the problem with keys in your pocket with the key case. It securely holds from 1 up to 6 keys and keeps your keys from jingling. Find the best Father's Day gift using my link rich.com/foodgeek, and right now you can save up to 40% through June 15th. That's rich.com/foodgeek. Thanks to the Rich for sponsoring this video. Let's talk about flour. You should use bread flour when you make sourdough bread, especially high hydration sourdough bread. I know it's not necessarily available in every local store, so what can you do then? You can bake with all-purpose flour, but whenever you pick up a recipe, you should think about how much water goes into it. Let me do a quick experiment, which you can also do with your flour. Each bowl here contains 100 grams of bread flour from my local supermarket. In each of the glasses are 65, 70, and 75 grams of water. I will test my flour and see what the optimal hydration is. I've never baked with this flour before. First, I'll mix the 65 grams of water into the flour. This gives us 65% hydration. As you can see, this dough is pretty stiff, Well, if you come from baking with yeast, you will think that it's almost fluid, but sourdough takes this to the limit. Let's mix this 70% hydration. As you can see, this is a less stiff dough, but not too fluid. If the gluten development is good, it looks ideal. Let's try 75% hydration. Okay, this is pretty slack. This might not be good if you're a beginner or your flour is low on gluten. Now we'll let the dough rest for 30 minutes and then return to it and check the gluten development. The way we test gluten is to pull out the dough as thinly as possible. This will show how strong the dough is. This looks good. If you want a dough that's easy to work with, go for something like this. This one has excellent consistency and good gluten development. For this flour, I would go with 70%. The last one, yes, it's pretty sticky. It wouldn't be impossible to work with, but if you're new, I'd say go for the less sticky one. Mixing your flour with whole grain flour can help it take more water, so consider that. Should you buy fancy artisan flours? Well, if you're a beginner, I wouldn't do it. Learn how to bake first, then purchase fancy flour. While the fancy flour is more expensive, it usually makes for much better bread, and it will also make your bread taste better. If you're into open crumb, that's a different subject that merits its own video. I've linked my recipe for open crumb in the card above. Let's talk about techniques. If you've read about making sourdough bread, you might have read about stretch and fold, slap and fold, or coil folds. They're all techniques that help gluten development, but honestly, fermentation is so long with sourdough bread that gluten will develop on its own. So my master recipe doesn't require you to do any of those. If you want to, you can even mix on a machine. It's all good. I'll go into the details in the recipe. A technique that you can't get around is shaping. The simplest way is boule shaping, which requires handling your dough scraper. Shaping a retard is more involved, and if you're new, I'd recommend working on your other skills first. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon. You can also buy some merch, use the super thanks, or use the links for tools and ingredients in the description. Those were the words. This is the recipe. There's a link in the description to the recipe on my website. First, you should mix all of the ingredients for the bread. To a medium bowl, add 600 grams of bread flour, 150 grams of rye flour or another whole grain, 15 grams of salt. Mix it with your fingers to distribute everything evenly. Then add 150 grams of sourdough starter, fed and grown to its peak. 500 grams of water. I really added more water because I'm making an 80% hydration bread, but that's because that suits my flour. Here's a little table for different hydrations if you tested your flour. If you didn't test your flour, I'd recommend you start at 60%. Gauge the dough and then add more water if needed. Mix until all of the flour has been hydrated. Take careful note of what consistency I'm getting when I'm mixing the dough. That should be your goal. If your flour lacks gluten, you should go for a stiffer dough. Okay, at this point, if you want to make a no-knead bread, jump straight to the dough's rise. Instead of mixing by hand, you can knead the dough with a machine until you have a nice supple dough, and then go to the dough's rise. Let the dough rest for 60 minutes. Otherwise, you can do 3 sets of stretch and folds spaced out by 30 minutes, or if you're making one loaf, you can use coil folds. I'm doing stretch and folds, that's my jam. I love feeling the dough develop. After the third fold, or if you did no knead or machine kneaded dough, add your dough to a see-through container with straight sides. Spray some baking spray in the container to help it release once the bulk is over. I can highly recommend these Cambro containers. They're not cheap, but they're built like tanks and can be used for other things than sourdough. Level the top of the dough. Then it's time to rise, and you need a target. If you're bulking warm, let the dough rise 25%. If you're bulking at room temperature, let the dough rise 50%. And if you're bulking cold, let the dough rise 100%. Then mark the container by the top of the dough and where it will hit the target. I'm bulking and my proofer set to 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So I go for 25% rise. The rise can take anywhere from 2 to 8 hours, so just be patient. When bulk is over, it's time for shaping. If you're making one loaf and did coil fold, skip straight to the final shaping. If you used one of the other methods, divide the dough into 2 equally sized pieces and shape each piece into a ball. Then let the dough rest for 20 minutes on the counter. And now it's time for final shaping. First, I'll show you how to final shape a boule. Flip over the dough, pull the sides out and stretch them towards the middle of the dough. This creates tension on the top of the dough. Flip the dough back over and tighten it using your bench scraper. There should be no flour on the counter because you want the dough to stick to the counter in front of the dough. This pulls the dough under and stretches the gluten network on the top of the dough. Then put the loaf in a banneton or use a dishcloth lined bowl. Dust with rice flour to create a non-stick layer. If you feel like it's not tight enough, stretch the sides towards the middle again. So this is how you shape a retard. Add water to your counter. This way you don't introduce flour into the layers of the dough, making some big ugly holes in the finished bread. Stretch the dough out into a rectangle. Fold up the bottom, then each side. Fold the top down and tug it in. Roll the dough pretty tightly. And then seal the edges. Add the dough to a banneton. You can stitch the back if the dough is on the slack side. Put both loaves in the fridge. It should be as cold as possible to stop fermentation completely. My fridge is set to 2 degrees Celsius, 35 degrees Fahrenheit. They should stay in the refrigerator for at least 4 hours, but can remain there for at least 48 hours with no problems. Also, you don't have to cover the dough. It gets dry on the bottom, but you will not see a difference after you bake. When it's time to bake, you have different options. You can either bake in a Dutch oven or create steam and bake on a baking steel. Let me first explain baking with steam. Heat your oven to 230 degrees Celsius, 450 degrees Fahrenheit. You should turn off convection. Add a baking steel and 2 pans at the bottom, one for a towel and one for lava stones. It should heat for at least 30 minutes, but more likely an hour depending on how thick your steel is. About 10 minutes before the bake, add boiling water to the towel to saturate the oven with steam. After adding the loaf, pour a cup of water on the lava stones. That will give an initial burst of steam, then turn the oven off. After 20 minutes, remove the steaming pan. Turn the oven back on to 230 degrees Celsius, 450 degrees Fahrenheit, and bake for 25 more minutes. That's how you bake with steam. Let me show baking with a Dutch oven. Heat your oven to 230 degrees Celsius, 450 degrees Fahrenheit. You can do it with or without convection. Add your Dutch oven to your oven rack. I'm using the Challenger bread pan, which you can see my review for in the card above. Let it heat for 30 minutes. When the oven's hot, grab a loaf from the fridge, dust it with rice flour to let it easily slide off the peel. Flip it onto the peel. Score it. And put it in the Dutch oven. Bake for 25 minutes. Just before the 25 minutes are up, prepare the second loaf. Dust it. Flip it. Score it. Move the other loaf out of the Dutch oven. And then bake it for 25 minutes. After 25 minutes, remove the finished loaf from the oven. Put it on a wire rack. Then remove the top of the Dutch oven and bake for 25 minutes more. Then remove the loaf. Put it on a wire rack and let both of the loaves cool down to room temperature. It's important. All right, now comes an essential part of my video, the crumb reveal. And now another critical aspect, reveling in the beauty of homemade sourdough bread. That's some gorgeous bread right there, and it's super delicious too. I hope I've opened your eyes to the fact that sourdough baking doesn't have to be as complicated as some people make it out to be. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below, and I will do my best to answer as many as humanly possible. I hope you learned something today. See you next time.